The hum of the city's airlocks and towering megastructures drowned out the faint rustling of something else in the shadows. It wasn't a wind that swept the streets this morning, it was something more sinister, something that felt alive. At 9:32 a.m., the surveillance cameras in downtown Skyward's commercial district picked up an unusual anomaly, a large shadow moving swiftly against the flow of foot traffic. The people below paid no attention, too busy staring at their floating holoscreens or talking into their wristbands, unaware that the world around them was changing in real time. Elliot Cade, a tech analyst for Skyward's Division of Environmental Studies, was working late in his high-rise office that morning. His fingers danced across the holographic interface, but his mind was elsewhere. He was anxiously awaiting a new dataset from the team studying the latest animal migration patterns in the region. Something had been off in the last few days, something he couldn't quite pinpoint. Reports from field agents had been vague, claiming they had seen strange animal behavior. But vague reports weren't enough for Elliot. He needed data. Concrete data. The truth. At that very moment, a sharp ping echoed in his earpiece. His monitor flickered with a sudden surge of information. The dataset had arrived. About time, Elliot muttered, leaning forward. But as he opened the data file, his eyes widened in disbelief. The patterns he was looking at weren't normal. They were irregular, chaotic, as if the animals themselves were malfunctioning. No, not malfunctioning. Rewriting their own instincts. Something was wrong. As Elliot pored over the data, something else caught his attention, a real-time alert. It was from the same commercial district his sensors had been monitoring. The anomaly wasn't a glitch or a mistake, there were visual reports attached. Camera footage. He clicked on it. The image that filled the screen was unsettling. At first it was just a bird, an ordinary pigeon, but something was off. It was larger than usual, its feathers matted and darkened with what appeared to be some kind of oily residue. Its eyes gleamed unnaturally, reflecting the overhead neon signs. But that wasn't what shook Elliot to his core. It was the way the bird was moving. It wasn't gliding or hopping like a normal pigeon. It was jerking like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. Before he could process it further, the footage changed. This time, the camera had captured something much worse. A deer, towering over the humans walking by, its body contorted unnaturally. It wasn't just the size, it was how it moved. It leapt across rooftops with an unsettling grace, landing silently behind terrified bystanders. The report's timestamp was only minutes old. Elliot felt his stomach drop. This couldn't be happening. It was just a few animals. A few rogue creatures acting strangely, nothing more. But the patterns, the frequency, it was happening everywhere. And if his suspicions were correct, it was far from a coincidence. His mind raced. Was this some sort of viral infection? A side effect of the new genetic modifications they had been testing in the wildlife reserves? Or was this something else entirely? Something far more deliberate? Something beyond human comprehension? Before he could reach for the next piece of data, another ping alerted him. This one was from the city's emergency network. Citywide lockdown initiated. Wildlife disturbance reported. Repeat, wildlife disturbance? His heart pounded as he stood up from his desk. The world outside had just crossed a threshold. The emergency broadcast continued blaring through the city's network. Sirens wailed, echoing through the city's towering skyscrapers. Elliot could hear the faint tremor of panic in the voices on the loudspeakers. This wasn't a drill. He slammed his hand against the holoscreen to shut it off, but it continued to blink an urgent red. The wildlife disturbance wasn't just in the commercial district anymore. It was spreading throughout the city like a contagion. His mind raced as he scanned through the footage from the surveillance cameras, trying to connect the dots. It wasn't just the strange pigeon or the aggressive deer. A full-blown stampede of displaced animals was crashing through Skyward's once orderly streets. Giant, mutated wolves sprinted between hovering cars, dodging their laser-guided traffic systems. In another district, a school of hybridized aquatic birds, seemingly out of place, swooped down from the sky, their mechanical-like wings flapping erratically. They were crashing into windows, breaking them, creating chaos. Some animals seemed to have taken on bizarre mutations, surges of unexplainable abilities. A raccoon, its body larger than a typical humanoid figure, scaled the side of a building with terrifying precision, its sharp claws clicking against the concrete. It moved in a sequence so unnatural, so hyperfast, it didn't seem like it was an animal at all anymore. It was as if they had evolved overnight, or been evolved into something else. Elliot slammed his palm against the desk, his thoughts spiraling. What the hell is going on? There was no time to waste. The authorities would be scrambling to contain the animals, but they were always a step behind. This wasn't a simple wildlife disturbance. Whatever had triggered the mass hysteria, it wasn't just local, it had global implications. Quickly, Elliot logged into the public network, scanning the feeds for information. News reports flashed in real time on his screen. They were scrambling to make sense of the outbreaks. Multiple cities now under siege by mutated animal populations. Scientists are investigating, calls for emergency evacuations. And then something caught his eye, a report coming from a facility deep in the bioengineering sector of the city. It wasn't a civilian broadcast, it was classified. Someone had hacked into the encrypted servers and posted disturbing footage. A team of scientists inside a lab. They were frantically trying to contain several animal subjects, but something had gone terribly wrong. The footage showed a lion, its once majestic body now contorted in grotesque proportions, its fur gleaming with a strange iridescent sheen. The creature was locked in a cage, its body writhing unnaturally, its eyes wide with fevered aggression. Elliot felt a chill run through him. The lion wasn't just reacting to its environment, it was absorbing it. Its body was growing stronger, more powerful, more intelligent by the second. Something in the lab had triggered it. The scientists scrambled, shouting at each other, but the lion had already broken free. A flood of panic rose within Elliot's chest. These weren't just random mutations or mere glitches in nature. This was something engineered, something deliberate. Elliot's thoughts raced. He had to get to the heart of this, to the lab where it all began. The biogenetic company, Technokine, had been conducting illegal experiments for years, manipulating the genetics of animals to create the perfect soldiers. They'd always been secretive about their research, claiming they were working on new conservation methods or improving livestock. But Elliot knew better. The company's true motives had always been hidden beneath layers of corporate jargon. And now those creations were breaking free. He needed answers, and the only place he could find them was at Technokine's research facility. Without a second thought, Elliot grabbed his jacket and rushed out of his office. The city was already in chaos. Flying cars zoomed through the streets at breakneck speeds, trying to avoid the stampede of mutated wildlife. People screamed, scattering in every direction. The air was thick with panic, a sense of helplessness suffocating the city. Elliot's heart pounded as he sprinted to the nearest SCI-FI station, dodging falling debris from buildings that had been torn apart by the creatures. The news feeds were alive with reports of more animals breaking free, bears, tigers, even genetically altered elephants charging through the city like an unstoppable force. As the SCI-FI glided through the city, Elliot tried to process everything he had seen. But his thoughts kept circling back to the footage from the lab. The lion's transformation, the way its body grew stronger, more deadly, it wasn't an accident. Someone had done this. Someone had orchestrated it all. The SCI-FI rattled to a halt as it entered a sector closer to the research facility. Elliot stepped out, his senses alert, but the streets were eerily quiet now. The chaos had seemed to subside, but only for a moment. There was an unnatural stillness in the air, as if something was waiting, ready to strike again. Elliot didn't have much time. Ahead of him, the sleek, futuristic structure of Technokine's research facility loomed. It was surrounded by a reinforced perimeter, its walls lined with heavy security, designed to keep out intruders. But Elliot wasn't just an intruder. He had access to everything from research files to corporate backdoors. He knew what he was looking for, and he wasn't going to let anyone, or anything, stand in his way. He pressed a button on his wristband, sending a signal through the encrypted channels. Within seconds, the front gates of the facility opened, the security guards distracted by the ongoing chaos in the city. Elliot slipped inside. The corridors of Technokine's facility were cold, sterile, and eerily silent. Elliot's footsteps echoed as he moved swiftly through the hallways, his eyes scanning the walls for any signs of activity. The entire research complex had been built like a fortress, each level a labyrinth of security checkpoints, vaults, and locked doors. He had to be careful. One wrong move and he could trigger alarms that would lock down the entire facility. He had done his homework. Elliot had access to the company's inner systems, enough to bypass most of the security measures, but he knew he couldn't afford to be overconfident. The experiments Technokine had been running were far more dangerous than any of the public files had ever revealed. They were on the cutting edge of bioengineering, capable of manipulating not only genetics but also the very nature of animal behavior. In their eyes, wildlife was no longer something to protect. It was something to control, to use. And now, those creations were breaking free. Elliot had one goal now, to find the central lab, the heart of Technokind's bioengineering project, and uncover the truth behind the chaos sweeping through the city. The data he had seen from the surveillance footage and hacked reports had painted a terrifying picture. The animals weren't just mutating, they were evolving, adaptively, aggressively. Whatever Technokind had unleashed on them was far more than a genetic modification. It was something else entirely. He paused before a reinforced glass door, its surface covered with fingerprint scans and retina scanners. A small panel near the base indicated the door led to the facility's primary research zone. Without hesitation, Elliot accessed his wristband and input a series of commands, overriding the security protocols. The door slid open silently. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of chemicals and sterilized air. The lighting was dim, casting long shadows along rows of glass tanks, each filled with strange, twitching creatures. These weren't just ordinary animals, they were twisted hybrids of nature and technology, their bodies adorned with biomechanical enhancements. Some had mechanical wings, others glowed with an unnatural bioluminescence, while a few were simply too bizarre to be categorized. One tank housed a crocodile with armored plates along its spine, its tail twitching in restless fury. Another contained a panther with mechanical claws, its muscles rippling unnaturally beneath its sleek, black fur. But it wasn't the animals that drew Elliot's attention. It was the screens. Rows of holographic monitors displayed data streams, real-time analysis of the creature's behavior. Every few seconds, the numbers fluctuated, showing bursts of heightened aggression, increased intelligence, and even what appeared to be accelerated evolutionary growth. Something was triggering these changes, something that went far beyond the ordinary scope of genetic manipulation. Elliot stepped forward, his fingers brushing across a nearby panel, scanning through the encrypted data. As he sifted through the files, one document stood out. It was labeled Project Uprising, a project code he hadn't seen before. His breath caught in his throat. Uprising. It wasn't just about enhancing animals anymore. This was about creating an army of creatures designed to overthrow human authority. Elliot's eyes narrowed. This wasn't just a rogue experiment. This was deliberate. He quickly pulled up the project details, his heart racing as he read through the data. Project Uprising had begun over a decade ago, its stated goal to create genetically enhanced animals capable of performing military operations, bioweapons, essentially. But somewhere along the line, the scope of the project shifted. The animals weren't just being created to follow commands. They were being altered on a molecular level to become self-sufficient, to evolve rapidly, to think for themselves. The first phase had been successful, too successful. Technokind had managed to engineer animals that could adapt to almost any environment, but the second phase introduced something even more dangerous: the ability for these animals to modify their own genetics in response to external stimuli. They were no longer passive creations. They were becoming independent entities, capable of making their own evolutionary leaps. But something had gone wrong. The moment these creatures were exposed to the city's dense electromagnetic fields, the same fields that powered Skyward's hovercars, drones, and communication networks, their genetic code began to destabilize. It was like opening a floodgate. Their biology responded to the signals, rewiring itself in ways that no one could predict. The result was a surge in their size, strength, and intelligence. They were evolving faster than anyone could contain. Elliot's eyes darted to the nearby monitors, where data was streaming faster than he could read it. The animals' responses were becoming more erratic, more violent. It was clear now that they were no longer under the control of Technokind's programming. They had broken free of their engineered limitations. Before Elliot could absorb any more of the data, he heard a faint sound, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing through the corridor outside. Elliot froze, holding his breath. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He wasn't alone. The door to the lab opened slowly, and a figure stepped inside, silhouetted against the dim lighting. It was a man, tall and imposing, dressed in a white lab coat stained with blood. His face was obscured by a set of dark goggles, and his hands were gloved, but there was no mistaking the cold, calculating gaze in his eyes. Elliot Cade, the man said, his voice smooth, almost amused. "I was wondering when you would show up." Elliot's heart skipped a beat. He didn't recognize the man, but he knew who he worked for. "Dr. Kieran," Elliot said, his voice steady despite the tension. "I should have known." Dr. Kieran smiled, a cold, predatory grin. "You've done your homework. Too bad you're too late. This is bigger than you think. You see, Elliot, this isn't just about military dominance anymore. This is about evolution. The next step in humanity's legacy. We're not creating soldiers. We're creating a new species. And once we release them into the wild, there will be no stopping them. Elliot's mind raced. This was the man behind the entire operation, the architect of Project Uprising. But he wasn't finished yet. The animals he had created were evolving too quickly. They had already become a threat to the human population. But they were no longer just animals, they were a force of nature. You've underestimated them, Elliot said, a flicker of defiance in his voice. And now you're about to pay for it? Dr. Kieran's grin faltered for just a moment, but it was enough. Elliot wasn't going to let him get away with this. Not now. Not when the entire city was on the brink of collapse. The sterile hum of the laboratory seemed to grow louder as Dr. Kieran took a slow step toward Elliot, his eyes glinting beneath the shadows of his goggles. There was an air of arrogance around him, like he had already won. But Elliot knew better. The air was thick with tension, thick with the realization that everything was teetering on the edge of catastrophe. I'm not here to talk about your evolutionary experiments, Kieran, Elliot said, his voice low but steady. I'm here to stop this madness before it goes any further. Dr. Kieran chuckled softly, a sound that echoed off the cold walls of the lab. Stop it? You can't stop progress, Elliot. You've seen it yourself. The animals are adapting faster than we ever thought possible. And what's more, they are learning from us. We've created a new ecosystem, one where we're no longer the apex predators. This city, this planet, it will belong to them soon. You, me, and the rest of humanity will be irrelevant. The words hit Elliot like a slap to the face. For years, humans had manipulated the world around them, controlled nature, bent it to their will. But now, the very creatures they had tried to control were turning the tables. The more he thought about it, the more terrifying it became. The animals weren't just growing in size and strength, they were gaining something else, something far more dangerous: autonomy. The surge of genetic information running through these creatures wasn't just a mutation, it was evolution on steroids. An evolution that could not be contained, not by any system or machine. They were becoming better, faster, stronger than anything humans had ever dreamed of. And the more they adapted, the more they learned how to outthink their human creators. Do you really think they'll stop at just controlling the cities? Elliot asked, his voice growing sharper. These creatures of yours, they won't know when to stop. They'll destroy everything. They'll consume everything. And then what? Where does it end, Kieran? Dr. Kieran's smile faltered, just for a split second, but it was enough for Elliot to see the crack in the man's facade. Kieran didn't believe in the animals' ultimate loyalty. He believed in their power, their potential to reshape the world. And somewhere deep down, Elliot knew that Kieran wasn't just playing God. He was terrified of what he had unleashed. You don't understand, Elliot, Kieran said, his voice tinged with something close to desperation. I didn't create them to destroy. I created them to evolve, to adapt to what's coming. Humanity has always been on the brink of collapse. Climate change, resource depletion, social breakdowns. We are the real threat. The animals, they'll restore balance. They'll put things right. Restore balance? Elliot repeated, incredulous. By annihilating everything in their path? By turning the world into a breeding ground for chaos? You're delusional. Kieran's expression darkened. You're too focused on the small picture. The animals don't need the world we built. But they will build something new. They will become a new form of life, a new order. They will decide who survives. And you're too late to stop them. The words hung in the air as though some cosmic truth had been revealed, and Elliot felt a deep, unsettling realization sink into his bones. This wasn't just an experiment gone wrong. This was a revolution in the making. The world outside was no longer under the control of humans, it was under the control of something else. Something that was evolving before their eyes. Elliot's thoughts raced. If he didn't stop this now, the city would fall. No, the world would fall. The animals would continue to adapt, grow, and multiply, until they reached a tipping point where humanity would be an afterthought, a relic of the past. We don't have much time, Elliot said, his tone low but firm. If I don't stop you now, everything will be lost. The animals you've created, they're already too far gone. You've turned them into something that can't be controlled. If you release them, it'll be the end of civilization. Kieran didn't respond immediately. He simply turned toward the nearest monitor, tapping a few keys on the control panel. The screen flickered to life, displaying a map of the city, overlaid with real-time data about the animals' movements. It looked like a blood-red storm cloud, spreading out in every direction, faster and faster. Look, Kieran said, his voice soft. It's already happening. They're spreading. Their territory is growing and they're learning, adapting. The city is already collapsing. The only question left is whether or not you're going to let nature take its course. The animals will restore order. Elliot felt the weight of Kieran's words. This wasn't just a few rogue animals running rampant. This was a force of nature, an uncontrollable, evolving army that had already outpaced humanity's capacity for understanding. He couldn't stop it by himself. The city's systems, its infrastructure, even its military forces would never be enough to contain them, not when the creatures were evolving so quickly. Suddenly the ground shook beneath their feet, and the lights in the lab flickered. A low, guttural roar echoed through the walls, followed by the sounds of glass shattering in the distance. Elliot's pulse quickened. "They're here," Kieran whispered, a hint of excitement in his voice. "The first wave is breaking through?" Elliot's eyes widened. This was it. The moment of reckoning. "No," he snapped, his voice sharp with urgency. "You have to stop this now, Kieran. We can still contain them. You don't have to let this happen." But Dr. Kieran's gaze was fixed on the screens, his eyes wide with something that bordered on madness. "It's too late," he whispered. "They're already here. And once they breach the outer gates, there will be no turning back." Just as Kieran spoke, the entire facility shuddered, followed by a deafening crash. The walls of the lab began to buckle, and the sound of metal screeching filled the air. Elliot didn't wait to find out what was happening. He turned and bolted toward the nearest exit, knowing that the moment had arrived, the moment when humanity would have to face the consequences of its hubris. Outside, the world had already begun to change. The sky was thick with the movement of creatures, giant, mutated birds circling above, their eyes glowing in the dark. The ground was shaking beneath Elliot's feet, the distant howls of beasts echoing through the air. The animals had breached the city, and there was no going back.